Ladies and gentlemen, this is Community Camera. I'm Walter Smith. We're here in the TV studio in the Learning Resources Center on Corning Community College campus. And if you've watched this program at all, you know that, but I like to remind you. And my guest today has been speaking on campus and discussing the war in the Gulf, and well qualified to do so as a senior correspondent with Time magazine. We'll find out a little more about his background in a moment. Welcome, David Aikman, to Community Camera.
Thank you, Walter. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we had a really nice turnout for you today. That's the biggest brown bag I remember. And, of course, the timing was right, and the topic is hot. But I thought you had a very appreciative audience. I was just saying to Maida Spiegler, who organizes that series, that you could hear a pin drop while you were talking. You really had, considering the room was crowded, there were people standing, people coming in and out of doors and so on, but really a rapt attention. So.
Well, it's interesting you should say that, Walter. I've done a fair amount of speaking on different campuses, including on subjects similar to today's. Not, of course, during the actual war that we've seen in the last few weeks. But I was struck here by the intelligence and interest and attentiveness of an audience in a place, and no disrespect to Corning Community College, but in a part of the United States where you generally assume that some people are interested in foreign affairs and others are not, and people come and go and take it or leave it. But for some reason, this particular crisis has galvanized a level of interest and intelligence that is both striking and, I think, encouraging.
Did you notice that, yes, it has galvanized. I was behind the fireplace, and I was watching people back there who couldn't see you, and they were paying attention. That's the ultimate tribute. I sat back there during a recent workshop we had and was so glad I couldn't be seen that I dozed off, and it was nice. Nobody was dozing.
One of the great skills in life, Walter, is to sleep without appearing to do so.
Yes. I've worked on that.
We all have.
But you know, it is, I noticed too from the questions, now obviously you were making some points that we'll try to get into that some people agreed with, some didn't agree. So far, and I know it hasn't gone on long enough perhaps to engender the kind of antagonisms Vietnam did, but the disagreement that I see so far, though serious and vigorously held, has been a lot more civil. The arguments to me have seemed more logical, less emotional, and a lot more civil.
Well, I think you've seen, in terms of demonstrations against the war, a very small core group of people who basically would be against any kind of military conflict whatsoever, including one perhaps even of dire self-defense. Although it's perhaps unfair to characterize some of the demonstrators as sort of permanent demonstrators, there nevertheless is a core of organized support for a number of causes on the liberal side of the spectrum, which will generate at any point a fairly significant number of supporters and demonstrations.
They're cross-cause, they'll
right.
transfer from
the
one
whole
cause
networking of the ecological, the environmental, the various minority rights organizations, and I'm not saying this in a disparaging way, but I think I agree with you completely that within the mainstream of people who are not constantly out there in the street for one cause or the other, there is a sense in this war, I think, certainly more than the Vietnam War, and perhaps even more than the Korean War, that the administration has really taken quite extraordinary pains, A, to avoid the war, and B, once the war began, to reduce destruction of civilians to a real minimum. Now, that hasn't been entirely successful. But we're not dealing, I think, in this particular conflict with the sort of disparagement of motives that was so common during the Vietnam War.
Personal.
Right.
And as someone who views things historically, as I do, it just strikes me that Korea, Vietnam, and we'll forget a couple of the little operations, but Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq, each one very different, I think. I don't think you can lump
No.
any two of
No.
those together.
No.
They're different situations.
Right.
We often, though, try to come up with a common
Right.
lesson from all of them. Well, I'm not going to do this exactly chronologically, but maybe in priority. One of the first questions I'd like to ask you, David, is what kind of man is Saddam Hussein? We think most of us agree he's not a good guy, but how bad is he? It sounds like the Carson show. Tell us a little about his early background and how his values and ideas have evolved.
Well, his values were formed in a very violent background where he was brought up by an abusive stepfather. At the age of 12, he was given a real live pistol by his uncle and told that wearing a loaded pistol was a way to feel a man and to defend yourself. And he began his political career literally as a street strong-arm guy, reinforcing the measures of the Ba'ath Party in Baghdad when there was great political confusion. And then, as you know, the great early moment of his career was when he was only 22 and he attempted to assassinate, with a group of conspirators, the then President Qasem of Iraq, escaped sort of in a heroic manner, and then led a life in the underground, and when he came back to Iraq in 1963, spent most of his early political career organizing security, intelligence, and torture machinery for the Ba'ath Party and then the Ba'ath government.
Is it true that, you know, I'm asking because you do, sometimes stories get exaggerated to make points and so on, but is it true, as I've read, that he enjoyed being personally present at some of the
Yes.
executions and tortures?
It is absolutely true. I personally interviewed a former Iraqi minister who had a number of best friends who were present when the public execution, well, it wasn't entirely public, I guess you'd have to call it the semi-public execution, took place of several Ba'ath Party senior officials who had been formally read out of the party at a public meeting just a few days earlier. And what happened was Saddam Hussein invited the regional heads of the Ba'ath Party throughout Iraq to Baghdad. He brought them into a large room. One by one, the 22 or so purge political victims were brought in. They were blindfolded. They had tapes on their mouths so they couldn't shout inflammatory slogans. And the Ba'ath Party officials who had been summoned to Baghdad were each issued with assault rifles. Saddam Hussein was present. He himself took part, and I was told by this former cabinet minister that each victim got about 500 bullets in his body as the entire senior cadre of party officials took part in the murder of their own former colleagues. And the story has gone around, which I cannot confirm, but sounds plausible, that the video was made of this and Saddam frequently used to show it, used to view it before going to bed at night. So,
home movies.
well, that's right. We're dealing with a character for whom violence is as much an everyday stock in trade of politics and of international politics as debate might seem within the confines of a civilized political democracy.
That's why I had a kind of chill when I saw that widely circulated picture while the hostages were still being held of the boy, the little boy,
Yeah.
I think it was an English
That's
boy,
right,
with him
yeah.
patting his head, and that in its own way was kind
yeah.
of curdling.
It really was.
So we're not, for purposes of wartime propaganda, making him out to be a bad guy.
No. I think the other thing you have to remember about this fellow Saddam, Walter, is that in addition to his background of violence, and after all you can blame environmental factors for people's behavior in many cases, he has made a series of choices, one after the other, that not only have involved violence throughout his political career, but have involved what I would call malevolent advance planning. In 1971, he set up a secret strategic planning group with the specific purpose of studying in as minute detail as possible the politics and societies of Iran and Kuwait, which we later know he invaded. He began in the early 70s to fortify Iraq with a series of nuclear-proof underground bunkers. Now, you don't do this unless you assume that you're going to be involved in a nuclear war sooner or later. And you don't think you're going to be involved in a nuclear war unless you have malign plans on people around you. So this is a man who has incredible imaginative foresight about his own ambitions and is utterly unblinking about the use of violence and has made a series of choices.
And they certainly look like disastrous choices now for his country, certainly the Iran war decision and now the Kuwait. I don't want to make any facile comparisons or parallels that are too full of holes, but the comparison with Hitler at points does seem a little striking. The frustrated childhood, the kind of gang mentality, the period in jail, the emergence as a kind of martyr, and now perhaps the willingness to go down in an Iraqi version of Götterdämmerung.
That's right. I was going to say Götterdämmerung,
which is a frightening reminder of the Hitler mentality.
Well,
is that completely far-fetched?
No, I don't think it is. The problem with using the term Hitler is because the analogy is so facile, people reject it out of hand and throw out the baby with the bathwater. But there are some striking parallels. Another one that you didn't mention is Hitler fashioned around himself the myth of the pan-German leader, the one who would unite all the Germans.
Yeah.
Saddam has lived the dream, the ambition of being a leader of the Arabs really ever since he joined the Ba'ath Party, with Iraq, and he has said this, as the Prussia of the Arab world. Added to which, of course, the Ba'ath Party took many of its ideas about organization, many of its own myths about creating a new society of clean, upright living people from the Nazis in the 1930s. It's not at all far-fetched.
Hitler had considerable support in the area during the war, again for a variety of reasons, of course, sometimes simply because our enemy's enemy is our friend, kind of. I'm not going to ask you to predict things like the start of the ground war or will he accept the Soviet offer, because by the time this hits the air, those things are going to have been answered, and I don't want you to have to answer
Thank you for
now.
not putting me on the spot.
Is there any chance for us getting out of this if a ground war does, and we'll win it, it's a matter of the costs and so on, and still be able to play a constructive role in the Middle East?
Well, I think there is, Walter. I think one of the great challenges to American diplomacy after the war, whether it's concluded in a matter of weeks or, heaven forbid, months even, will be to mend fences with those Arab states that have been somewhat hostile or very hostile to the coalition, to have influence without appearing to be a clumsy big brother. Mm-hmm. I mean, it will, if the United States can, so to speak, hand off to a pan-Arab security force, Egyptians, Syrians, Gulf states and so forth, in a way that genuinely preserves the security of the Northern Gulf region without threatening Iran and without provoking other parts of the Arab world to anti-Western reaction, that will be a major achievement, and it's a challenge.
How about the UN? Does this increase or decrease the prestige of the United Nations?
Well, I think if Operation Desert Storm leads to a resounding defeat of the Iraqi forces, if Iraq is cleanly kicked out of Kuwait, and if the United States then goes back to the United Nations Security Council and says, thank you folks for being with us in all this, it will immensely accrue to the prestige of the UN. But that could be a double-edged sword.
Well, you made a comment earlier today that if this does work, and we've had this UN support, which so far has held together, we'll owe something, won't
Indeed
we, to
will,
that
yeah.
organization?
You bet. And most of our moderate Arab allies, and even not so moderate Arab allies like Syria, will come back and they'll say, hey, we backed you in a forceful implementation of various Security Council resolutions condemning Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. What are you going to do to implement other Security Council resolutions affecting the Arab-Israeli dispute?
Do you have a feel, David, for the Soviet strategy at the present and what future role they hope to play?
Well, I may be going out a little bit on a limb on this, but perhaps not too much. I think that the Gorbachev peace offer was the result or the reflection of a rising role of the Soviet military in the formulation of Soviet foreign policy, and an effort by the Soviet Union, after 2 or 3 years aligning itself completely with the West on major foreign policy issues, to get back into the Middle East as a player, to pose as the defender of Arab interests against Zionist and imperialist forces from the United States.
So they have certain specific interests they're trying to protect in the Middle East, but also they're almost, they're trying to reestablish their role as a major power. They've almost slipped from that
That's right.
status.
I think you're absolutely right. What we forget about the Soviets is that it is not just Marxist-Leninist ideology which is behind a Soviet self-perception as a major world power. Even without Marxism-Leninism, even without the Soviet Union as a multinational state consisting of 15 component republics, if you just had Russia alone, Russia would be a major European and world power with nuclear weapons, 145 million people, 90% of the petroleum reserves of the Soviet Union, or 70%, 90% of the mineral reserves, a major player on the world scene. Russia traditionally has regarded itself as destined for world influence. How that influence is played out is a matter for debate, but it's an important influence.
I believe your academic credentials relate to the Soviet Union, the republics, the different language and cultural groups. Is that
Yes, that's correct.
Where did you do your work?
Well, I did my undergraduate work as a Russian major at Oxford University in England. Then when I came over...
Fairly good institution.
Yeah, it's a certain reputation amongst some scholars. Then when I came over to the States, I did a master's degree at the University of Washington in Seattle in Central Asian Studies, which was sort of, in a way, creeping out of Russia towards Central Asia and China, and eventually I slipped over the Chinese wall and I included Chinese in my studies. But then I moved into the history realm, which is why I'm comfortable talking to you, and focused on modern Russian and Chinese history. And so...
what were your plans then, as far as career plans? Were you thinking even then of getting into the to news coverage or...
Not at all. No, I wanted to...
Correspondent?
The last thing I ever wanted to be was a journalist. In England, unlike the United States, at least until recently, journalists were always rather seedy characters in dirty raincoats who slipped into and out of the tradesman's entrance in polite establishments. I wanted to be a diplomat, and even when I was first studying in the United States, I was still eligible for entry into the British diplomatic service, but to their eternal wisdom, they turned me down. So I was left, well, what do I do now? Academic life? I liked it in some respects, but at that point what was happening on American campuses was the great upheaval of the late 60s, which was fascinating. I'd be reading in my history of Russia about the To the People movement of the Russian students in the 1870s. And out of the window I'd hear, "Power to the people." And I thought, it's more fun finding out what these speakers are saying and listening and sort of writing it down than it is reading about history. And that's how I got into reporting.
You think coming of age in England, and this could apply to any country, gave you a little different starting point? Of course it did, but a different perspective that might have been helpful in analyzing some of these?
Oh, I think so. Yes, I'm extremely grateful for my primary, secondary, and undergraduate education. I had the great advantage of a formal classical education, Latin and Greek and Roman history, at a very early age. And the rigor of that discipline is they don't allow you to express your feelings very much. You really have to deal with what's in the book. And while that may be a bit dry, it is also a wonderful way of training the analytical approach. And then it was a great academic background for some of these other studies.
Yes, and I think, and I'm not trying to condemn other journalists, correspondents, news media people, or to be overly flattering to you, but many of them do not have a very deep background in a broad educational way to help them to understand the things they're covering.
I agree. I think it's, when I talk to young people, that sounds as though I'm about 85, but when I talk to, say, undergraduates who are interested in journalism and they say, what should I study? I say, the first thing you should not study is journalism.
Yeah.
With no disrespect to people who teach journalism, I think it's a wonderful thing to teach. Journalists, before anything else, need to be educated.
Yeah.
They need to know things. You can't go into instant analysis of politics, economics, and culture, as we journalists are supposed to do, without some kind of background.
Yeah, and I think to be a good teacher at whatever level, it's best not to concentrate too much on education.
Absolutely,
courses.
yeah.
It's a sort of a similar thing. Well, since we did break off a little bit from the Iraq thing, and since you have this Russian background, one question that's going to affect the Middle East and everything else is Gorby going to make it? He's already well on the way to be another complete dictator. But what are your odds? What odds do you give him of?
Well, I've always felt about Gorbachev that we in the West, while correctly admiring his humanitarian talents and his basic decency, I think, as a human being, have chosen to overlook his ideas. And his ideas are those of a communist. He keeps telling us this. He is therefore not willing to see the evolution of the Soviet Union into a multi-party democratic state in which the communists are just one of a bunch of several parties competing for power. He doesn't believe that is Russian destiny, and to that extent he is willing to be pushed to more hardline positions by elements in the KGB and the military.
And the old bureaucrats.
And to some extent the old bureaucrats, yes.
The top military who helped arm, advise, work so closely with Hussein in Iraq must be quite disturbed to see their equipment being bombed and their allies being...
That's right.
We're getting near the end of the program, David. What do you think the Iraqi people, to get back to Iraq again, will stick through thick and thin with Saddam? Or is there a point at which, you know, he has made some wrong decisions. That long Iran war, they got nothing out of that. How long?
Well, as you probably know, Walter, not so long ago there were reports of anti-Saddam demonstrations in certain Iraqi cities. The public exuberant reaction to the first indications of his Iraqi willingness to withdraw from Kuwait, although the provisions suggested by Saddam were later withdrawn by him and were meaningless, shows that ordinary Iraqis want peace. Like ordinary people everywhere else, they don't like dictatorship. And once he is out of the way, I'm quite sure many of the same people who were on TV explaining how much they disliked America will come out and say, we couldn't say anything because we were terrified for our lives.
When those first peace rumors started circulating, we heard stories of Iraqis out celebrating, shooting in the air,
That's
which
right.
seems to be a standard way of expressing jubilation there. But they must want this thing over quickly.
Of course they do, yes.
The president of Turkey made an interesting statement a couple of days ago. Did you see that? He said that he was discussing whether or not something short of destroying Saddam's power should be acceptable, and he said, no, we must break his back. And then went on to say that the Iraqi people have this burden removed from them. I thought that was
very perceptive.
Yeah, and I thought it rather brave for the Turkish president, where he's already running into some problems on his support. But he's up there, of course, as he borders Iraq, has some claims of his own on some territory up there. Iran has some claims. Kuwait, of course, has been violated. And I don't think, though, that we want a partition of Iraq or a destruction of Iraq, do we?
No, I think what we want, if this is conceivable, is a democratic, pluralistic Iraq in which none of the minorities, neither the Kurds nor the Sunni, and certainly not the 55% Shiite Muslims, have the kind of control over the rest of the country that the largely Sunni regime of the Ba'ath Party under Saddam Hussein now has. We should see a democratic reconstruction of the Iraqi polity.
That would be a country then that we and its neighbors could live with.
Yes.
And I'm sure there would be help for Iraq, help in rebuilding the damages of the war and so on. If there were that kind of government, we're certainly not going to do that if Saddam Hussein stays in power.
There's no way. The whole equation in the Middle East would change if Iraq were democratic, and if, as I think probably will happen, Kuwait became a constitutional monarchy. That, I think, would be the beginning of the emergence of real political stability in the Gulf region.
You were asked earlier today about, was it an American war or was it a UN war? And of course, in proportion of numbers, it's an American war. 80%, I suppose, is a rough ballpark figure. But there hasn't been quite this kind of coalition assembled in recent history, though, has there?
Not only that, but you hear little bits and pieces from other parts of the world that I think are very telling. Walter, there was a wonderful story from Beijing, China, about people writing to the American embassy in support of the American effort, overwhelmingly. One bank teller saying he wanted to volunteer for the Marines. People offering suggestions as to how to defeat this dictator. Where folks have a sense of the real distinction between freedom and tyranny, they overwhelmingly support freedom, even if they have not personally experienced it. Somehow they know what it is.
So we may be not always the bad guys. Yeah.
I think in this case we're on the right side.
Yeah. I actually talked to someone who has different opinions on the war than I have, who perhaps in the heat of the disagreement said, well, he said, President Bush and Saddam Hussein, there's no difference, they're just alike.
Well,
I said, wait
a
minute.
I have a response to that, which is, if you believe that, you should be forced to live in Iraq for a couple of months.
I stopped the conversation right then, because I think we had to agree to disagree. We're out of time.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. You have such an interesting background and resources. I wish this were an hour program.
Well, it's kind of you to have me.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is Walter Smith. My guest has been David Aikman, talking mainly about the Gulf, and I hope you will tune in again. We had a very interesting day on campus with our visitor. Thank you all for watching. For Community Camera, this is Walter Smith saying goodbye till next time.